anticipate some people are going to come in late, so maybe we should clap for them or shame them as they do the walk of shame to the front. Okay, so Genesis. How many of you had fun last week? Yeah, Genesis. Here's my my summary of Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. God creates everything, and it is good. Then he creates Adam and Eve, and they are very good. They're made in his image, which is an incredible thing to say, right? I didn't touch on this last week, but the idea that Adam and Eve are made in God's image, especially in the ancient world, to say that we worship a God that we're made in his image would have been laughable, because the other religions in the ancient world are God reigns on high, and everything you're doing is just trying not to make him mad. You don't want to get struck by lightning. You want your harvest to grow. You want fertility and food on your table. And so everything in your life is organized not to make God mad. And then the Hebrew people say, we were made in his image, and at the beginning he walked in the garden with us. And that was I'm not sure. I need to hear more about that. So really cool story. So they're in the garden. Life is good. God tells them, be fruitful and multiply. He's inviting them to be his representatives on the earth. They get to name the animals. They get to care and bring flourishing to the creation. And there's only one thing that they can't do, which is what? Eat from the tree of good and evil. We talked about it last week. That is because in all of the created order, the one thing God did not invite them into was to determine good and evil for themselves. The serpent shows up and says, there's more, you could be like God. We pointed this out last week. They were already like him. Do you remember that? He already made them in his image, but the serpent convinces them that there's more, and so they take and they eat. And then God drop kicks them out of the garden, more or less, and that was the end of that. Between Adam and Eve and Noah, there are a couple little tidbits there. The first thing that we find out after Adam and Eve are booted out of the garden is they have some kids, and what do their kids do? One of their sons kills another son. So that didn't take long, right? We're 3 chapters in, good, perfect, beautiful world, flourishing garden, rivers running through, naked and unashamed, and now all of a sudden we have murder between a family member. And so the idea is that the good and perfect creation is now spiraling out of control, and everything in its sin is trying to pull it back to the chaos that it began with. So today we're going to talk about Noah. And Noah, his story kind of picks up at the end of chapter 5. And I think we're going to draw some cool parallels between Noah and Adam and Eve and the creation. And so we're going to do that tonight. We're going to have some fun doing it. So my hope is that we're going to more or less have 3 snapshots of Noah. I think Noah before the flood, Noah kind of during the flood, and then Noah after the flood. How many of you, just out of curiosity, read this whole chunk today or recently? Okay, a few of you. Okay, Eric came and told me, he's like, man, the ending is weird. How many of you would say the ending is weird? Did not see that coming. Spoiler alert, but that was not in character, so we're going to talk about that. Okay, so let's talk about Noah. This comes from the end of chapter 5, and it says this: when Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son. Bless his heart, right? I'm almost 35, and I'm worn out from having kids. And he called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. So before we jump into this, if you're taking notes, why don't you just put a star next to this? Because the first thing we learn about Noah is this, is that his dad names him Noah, in Hebrew Noach, which means rest. And it's the kind of rest, it's not Sabbath. You remember the word Sabbath. Sabbath is a rest from work. The rest that Noah is named, Noach, it's a relief. It's like you have a heavy burden on you and it's lifted. And so it's sort of like the deep exhale of finally I get to take a break. Does that make sense? Sabbath rest is like this good and beautiful gift that you get to enjoy everything around you. This rest is like we are being crushed by something and the crushing ceases. So the question is, you can put a question mark or a star, is we're going to ask this at the end. Does Noah live up to his name or not? if you've ever heard me preach a sermon before, you can probably guess. He kind of does and he kind of doesn't, but we're going to get there. Okay, so this is who Noah is. At the very beginning, his dad names him this name, and there's this inkling at the very beginning. The first thing we know about Noah is there is a person or a group of people in his family that have put their hope in him, that there's something about him that they have put their hopes into, that he would live out and relieve them from their suffering. So that's important. So that's who Noah is and where he comes from. But he comes into a world, I think I put it in your outline. He comes into a world that has, in 6 chapters, well, technically, in chapter 2, the creation is still good and beautiful, right? In chapter 3, it starts that way. So in chapter 3, halfway through, the creation is still good and perfect without sin. And now in chapter 6, so how many chapters later? 3, okay? Now we have a creation that is spiraled so out of control. This is what God says about it in chapter 6. I just wrote a summary because we're not going to go through all of it. He says there's 3 things about the creation that are happening. Number 1 is sexual corruption. So he says, it says this literally in verses 1 through 4. It says that the men of the earth realize that the women, when they grow up, are attractive. And so they, ready for the air quotes, take them to be their wives. This is a Hebrew innuendo. It literally means that they just take them and use them for sexual gratification at will. That's what it means. And so God says the first thing that I have to say about the created order is that they are so corrupted in their sexual lust and desire and debauchery that it is so far beyond the intention that these people are out of control. So I wrote that down for you. The second is he says that wickedness, and I wrote the quote, that every intention of the thoughts of their hearts were only evil continually. I read a commentary this week, and the scholar said it this way. He said, these people, if we want to visualize it, every time they come to a crossroad of should I make decision A or decision B, the process that they think through to figure out which decision they should make is the lens of evil and wickedness. That is how they're deciding what decision to make. That's how corrupt people are. And the third thing is that they are filled with violence. We're going to see this later. God's going to say something that's kind of the forerunner of the phrase that we get, an eye for an eye. And the reason he says it, he's going to explain it, is that when you kill somebody, this is the ultimate acknowledgement that you do not recognize God's image in another person. So throughout the Old Testament, murder becomes the worst thing. Why? Because when you murder somebody, you're acknowledging that you don't see the image of God in them. So these are the 3 things that have overtaken the entire creation. So the Lord said, this is verse 7, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. For I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, I want to go on like a little mini rant. I was going to ask if that's okay, but it's just going to have to be okay. So I think that we're about to enter a territory that can be a little difficult, and let me explain why. Of all of the stories in the entire Bible, whether you are a Christian or a Hindu or you're Muslim or you're an atheist, there are a handful of stories that I would say are almost universal. Everybody knows them. Would you agree with that? This is one of them, right? Russell Crowe starred in a movie that was very loosely based on this story, right? So we have these just few stories. We have Noah and the Ark, or Noah's Ark, if you will, if you ever worked on felt boards as a kid. What other stories would you say are stories that most people have heard of or are familiar with? Jonah and the whale, okay. Crucifixion. David and Goliath is a big one, yeah. Maybe the crossing of the Red Sea. Was it Disney or who made Prince of Egypt? Yeah. So there's these stories. And if we're not careful, we're going to take what we think we know and we're going to bring it with us into the story. So let me tell you the first thing that I think we have to get over. When you think of this story, what is the title of this story in your mind? Noah's Ark. How many of you said, yeah, that's what I was thinking, Noah's Ark? Okay, so already I would say we got the story wrong. Because already we have decided that this story, and this is not like an offense to you, because that's how I thought of it too. I always think of it, Noah's Ark or Noah and the flood, something like that. But do you notice a character in the story that is not in the title Noah's Ark? God. This entire chunk of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, the primary actor, the primary figure is not Noah, it's not Adam and Eve, it's not the serpent, it's God. So this story is not about Noah and an ark. This story is about God. And if it's about God, then there is an angle to the story that sometimes, I think there's a piece of it we just miss because we think Noah's Ark. There's another piece that we miss because it makes us uneasy. And I would say the primary reason that this story is in the Bible, because you all know there's more stories that get left out of the Bible, right? Is because this is the first time on a large scale we're going to find out how does God deal with this thing called sin. We saw that he booted Adam and Eve out of the garden, and there are some curses for them, that they're going to toil and labor, right? That childbearing and the serpent is going to come after them and there's going to be danger. But what is God going to do in a world that every single person is sinful? Can he boot them all out of the garden? They're already out of it, right? So I would say this story is about God and sin. That's what this story is about. It's not as catchy as Noah's Ark. I'll give it that. So I want to pause, and we're going to try to remember periodically that even though we're studying Noah tonight, the primary actor of this story is God. And we're going to see this. It's going to say that God commanded X, Y, and Z. And this is so cool. It will say almost immediately, then Noah obeyed everything God commanded. It's why the title of tonight, we kind of missed it last week, but each week is the life of fill in the blank. And tonight is the life of obedience and salvation. That because of Noah's obedience, it leads to salvation in the sense that there is a flood coming that will eradicate sin and everything in the creation, and Noah and his family will be saved. So let's read this again, and I think we're going to kind of reframe it. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. I put a little footnote there, and I wrote a word that I cannot pronounce and I have never really seen until now, but I figured vocabulary word, we can learn it. It's anthropopathism. Say that 10 times. Turn to your neighbor and say it. Anthropopathism. Yeah. This is what it means, or I think it means. I just learned this word Sunday night, late maybe Monday morning. I can't remember. Basically, it's the phenomenon of us trying to assign God a human emotion and then understanding what God is feeling based on what we would feel. And that is a problem, isn't it? So here's the idea. That in verse 7, it says that God says, I am sorry that I have made them. Now, when you read that, what is your first thought about what God is feeling? He's mad, okay? Regret, that's what I wrote down. I wrote regret, yeah. Heartbroken, sad, okay. Painful, disappointed, all of that together, right? So here's the problem. The problem is that in Hebrew, this word can mean like a lot of stuff. And depending on how you write it, in English, it changes how we understand it. So I just put my opinion. I try to make sure I write the word opinion so you don't like take it to the bank and say this is what it means. This is what I think it means. I think that a better definition would be that God was grieved. Why is he grieved? Because he created something good and perfect, and part of his perfect creation is that he gave humans free will. And that is a good, beautiful thing, because God didn't create you as a robot or a puppet. He created you with the ability to choose. And what did Adam and Eve choose? They chose sin. So I don't think it's saying that God is sorry, because this is rabbit trail. This is a theological problem if God is sorry. Because the question would be, how could the all-powerful, all-knowing God create something knowingly that's going to betray him, and then he's like, oh man, I made a mistake. I better eradicate it. Can God make a mistake? No. Okay, so we have a problem. I would say that this is the word grief. That doesn't describe God's emotion because we can't assign God a human emotion, but this is close. It's, I made something perfect. I invited them into perfect unity and relationship with me and the creation. I gave them everything they could ever ask for. Remember how he kept providing for them? Remember how even when they sinned, he provided for them? He's grieved. He's grieved that the good and beautiful thing has now spiraled so out of control that it looks more like the chaos of pre-creation than it looks like what God intended. And then there is this full stop break, verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Very interesting. So Noah makes a reappearance after being told that his dad named him this thing, that hopefully we're going to find relief. We're going to find respite from the toil and the pressure that we're under. And we find out that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, to contrast that with all of the other people, this is an interesting case, isn't it? Because what we just painted is that every single human on the planet is wrapped up in this ideology that is sexually perverse, violent, and the intention of their heart, the way they make decisions, is wicked and evil, except Noah. Very, very interesting. I wrote a little list. I think it's here. Do you have a little list here? He found favor in the eyes of the Lord? Okay. So in the midst of all the chaos and the spiraling out of control of creation, we learned this in chapter 6. That he found favor in the eyes of the Lord. That's verse 8. And verse 9, it says he was blameless in his generation. The very beginning of what we know as chapter 7 is that he was righteous in his generation. Now, there's going to be a discussion question here, but I want to kind of hypothetical for a second. How many of you have ever felt like you are the only one in a crowd that maybe thinks or believes something? Anybody ever felt that way before? Anybody ever been at like an awkward Thanksgiving or something? This happens to me. This is going to go on YouTube, so maybe I should be careful. I've been in lots of situations where it's like, man, it would be like a good formal thing to like do like a blessing or a prayer or whatever you do. Andy, would you do it? And then I'm like, oh gosh, put on the spot. Like, I don't mind doing it, but I know while I'm doing, everyone in the table is like rolling their eyes like this is dumb. And have you ever felt that feeling before? Now, imagine that on steroids. And not only are you feeling that way, but what you're feeling is actually true, that you are the only person who is living righteous. You're the only person living with integrity. You're the only person blameless in God's sight. What kind of pressure is that? So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, why does this strike me? Any of you watch our podcast, Vodcast, on YouTube? I was thinking back about it because I was thinking a lot of the people that I got to chat with are people that I would say in my own life are people who more or less are upright and people of integrity. Maybe they weren't always, but where I find them now, I look at them and I think, I want to be like those people. Would you agree? And I was thinking, they all have something in common in their story. And that's when following Jesus becomes really difficult. Guess what each one of them had? They had a support system. They had a church. They had a family. They had at least one friend that was doing it with them. Noah has none of that. So this is a man of absolute integrity and faithfulness and obedience. We're going to see that over and over and over. I think the first time comes in verse 22 of chapter 6. It says, Noah did all of this. He did every single thing God commanded of him. And this is going to be repeated over and over and over. So what is Noah's roadmap? His roadmap is, if God commands it, I'm going to do it. This is going to get really awkward because God is about to tell him to build a giant boat big enough to hold all the animals. How do you think the rest of the world looks in and sees this situation? Are you sure you heard God's voice correctly? This is pretty outlandish, right? So why don't we pause? There's a discussion question if you want to team up with another table. I think that with 3 or 4 minutes, there is no way for every person to share. So how about this? Why don't you, 1 or 2 people share, and then at the next discussion question, someone else can jump in. So the question is there. It's how have you dealt with situations of being surrounded by people who don't care about God? discuss maybe ways that you've gotten it right before and you've lived with integrity, and maybe some ways that you've totally blown it. So, ready, go. I'm with Terry. There's not enough time. I'm not trying to just chop it off. I'm trying to get better with the discussion questions, but I want to make sure there's some time at the end for a little bit more discussion than we had. So again, there's not ever going to be enough time for everybody to share every question. So just try not to hog the second question if you answered the first one. That would be a good way. I was thinking about this question, and I was thinking, sometimes I feel like working as a pastor, there's not always like a really good spot to tell you like honest life stuff. Like, have you ever felt like, I wonder what real life is like for Danny or Scott or Andy? Have you ever felt that way? So I was thinking, here's an honest example. So one of the times you've got it right, and one of the times you've failed. I would write miserably, and I will tell you a little story. I was 20 years old, and I turned 21. I had been a Christian for about 4.5 years, and at that point, I had become a Christian at the tail end of high school, in my junior year of high school. I was like all in, and a lot of my Christian faith was driven by feeling like I knew nothing and I had to catch up. That was very much my personality. So I remember just reading the Bible from cover to cover in not that much time. And to be honest, I was reading over stuff that I'm like, I have no idea what that means. I'm just going to keep going. It wasn't like stopping to ask questions, anything like that. I was like, somehow all these kids in the youth group seem to know a bunch of stuff in here. I know nothing, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. And that's very much how my faith was. And that was kind of a piece of it. I decided that God was very clearly calling me into some type of ministry, so I went to Point Loma, Nazarene University, to study the Bible and study preaching and those sorts of things. And I loved it. I was all in. I was an intern at a church. This is a funny side story, but I just thought of this the other day. Every year at the beginning, I would have to go see an academic advisor, and part of his job was to help you find volunteer and internship opportunities to help you like in a career path. And so I remember his name was Dr. Smith, the Silver Fox, still one of my greatest mentors. I communicate with him often. And he said, okay, I created a plan for you if you're willing. And I said, I'm willing. You were doing ministry for 50 years. I'll do whatever you say. So he said, I want you to go to this little dying church, and I want you to go to their 7:30 traditional service. And then after the 7:30 hour is over at 9 a.m., I got permission from the Sunday school teacher for you to go into the seniors' Bible study. And I was like, I'm trying to do youth ministry. And I remember he said, I know that's what you want to do, and you're going to do that. And so you have to know how church works, and you have to know who church is built on, and it's not built on 15-year-olds. It's built on people with decades-old faith. So I was considering adding you to the choir too, and we didn't do that. So I did that. And it was a wonderful time in my life, and it was beautiful, and I learned so much. But then I decided, I had a nasty accident. I broke my kneecaps and my foot, longboard skateboarding down a parking garage that was not for downhill skateboarding. And I was coming out of this season of depression, and on a whim, I went to this office at the university, and I signed up to study abroad. And I went to Costa Rica. I left 2 days after Christmas, right before my 21st birthday. I knew nobody. I was going in with all of these students from universities all over the country, and we were going to live in Costa Rica together. And I would say my Christian faith went with me, if I'm honest, for probably less than 2 weeks. I was surrounded by people I didn't know. I kind of clicked into pre-Christian. I know how to be adaptable and figure out who it is. And so this is what I noticed about myself. The first thing is kind of language, like just how I talk began to change. And then kind of morals began to loosen up. And then before you know it, you're 2 months in, and you might as well just be a normal frat guy from North Carolina like everybody else. And that's I think, coming back, realizing the shame of, oh my gosh, part of this whole thing is representing Jesus in a way that not only did you not do that, but people also knew you were studying to be a pastor, and what do they think of that now, And I think we carry some of these things with us, even though we know God has forgiven us and gives us grace. I think it's really important that we submit those things to God and we don't carry them with us into our story. So I just thought I would share that with you. You probably haven't heard those stories before. Good? I didn't even sweat through my shirt too bad telling you. Noah and the ark, but more than Noah and the ark, we are talking about God. So chapter 6 unfolds. And this is incredible because verse 8 ended this way. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And you know what God does? He decides to tell Noah the whole plan. He gives it to him. This is, Noah, I'm going to pull back the curtain and you're going to see the whole plan. Why? Because you have become righteous. You found favor in my sight. So this is, I think, often even for us today. I think you wonder how come it seems like people who know Jesus really well, why do they always seem to be like ahead of the curve? I don't think it's a mistake that people who are close to Jesus seem to know what's coming or they know how to react when things come. They seem to be not swept off their feet. I think the New Testament would say they're built on a solid foundation and storms don't push them off the foundation. And so Noah is close to God's heart, and so God, this is what he tells him. The first thing he tells him is that he's going to make an end to all flesh, and he's going to do it by a flood. He says that Noah is to make for himself and his family an ark, and God gives him the detailed instructions. That's a curveball, right? I'm going to eliminate all of sin on the earth. Also start building a boat. That's weird. He says that he's going to establish a covenant with Noah, and he will protect Noah's family. My outline says he will protest Noah's family, which is incorrect. Number 4, he will preserve, Noah is to preserve living things. Who else was supposed to preserve and help living things thrive? Adam. So there's going to be this element that's going to emerge that Noah is, in a lot of ways, this second Adam. That in some way, God is about to flood the creation. Do you remember how we found the created order or the pre-created order in Genesis chapter 1? That God's Spirit was hovering over the waters. Okay, so now we're going to go back to that, except this time it's not just God's Spirit. It's going to be God's Spirit and also this big giant boat floating around, right? So he says that's going to happen. Noah is to store up food for himself and his family and all of the animals. That's going to be a lot of food, right? So start storing it up. And it says Noah did all of this just as God had commanded. Now, I wanted to go on another mini rant because there's 2 pieces to this. The first one is this seems incredibly violent in and of itself. Would you agree with that? Does it strike you in any way that God is very frustrated, beyond frustrated, he's angry, righteously angry, that his created order is acting violently towards themselves and they're blurring out the image of God by what they're doing? Does it seem strange to you that God's plan is to wipe it? There's something about it that I think doesn't sit right. I think if I'm honest, there's something about it that makes me scratch my head. And I heard this a while back, and it wasn't about this, but I think it applies. And somebody I trust was preaching a sermon, and I trust that they are incredibly good at studying, and so I'm just going to take this person at his word. And he said that sociologists have discovered something interesting in language across cultures. And it's that about 2.5 or 3 years old, in just about every culture on the planet, kids learn how to say something. It's not their first words, but it's one of their very first concepts. Do you guys have any idea what that is? More. Nope, not more. Beyond that. It's beyond that. It's conceptual. It's not fair. Yeah, that's not fair, right? So this is beyond no and mama, dada, more, please. This is like conceptual. It's I'm looking at something and this is not right. This is not fair. How many of you have kids and you can remember, oh, I remember. That was probably, my son Colton is just shy of 4 years old now. He's definitely like, that's not fair. So let's unpack this for a second. If this is true across all cultures, is there a good chance that maybe that's part of who we are as human beings? If it's true in all cultures, then it's not cultural, it's part of the human condition maybe. Why would it be that kids look at the world and say, that's not fair? What would it be about them, the image of God in them, that would say that? A sense of right and wrong, which I think we could kind of piggyback and say maybe justice. That's not just. That's not right. And so they're beginning to realize that there is like a world, and how it works is maybe like that consequence is not fair. It doesn't fit the crime. Or how come they got 2 cookies and I only got 1? That's not fair. Are you following me? Now here's the problem. The problem is even though that's embedded in us, how many of you would say regularly you see something where you just say, that's not fair? It's not fair. I used to think of this often. It would break my heart doing youth ministry because all these kids would come in and they wouldn't know it, but I would know the backstory. And you would see a kid struggling and you would say, at this age, it has nothing to do with their own choices. It has everything to do with the choices of their parents. And they're living out the consequences. That's not fair, right? Okay, you're tracking with me. But here's the problem, is that when we think of things that are fair and unfair, we do through the lens of our human condition, which is sin. That is our human condition. So let me give you an example. It's probably very egregious for kids, so that's a good place to start. Are kids really good at noticing things that are not fair when they're the ones getting less? Right? Okay, so let's say we have 2 kids, 2 4-year-olds sitting across the table. One of them has 2 cookies and one of them has 1 cookie. Who's going to say, this situation is not fair? The one with 1 cookie. Is the kid with 2 cookies going to say, this isn't fair, I'll give you half? Probably not. That is the concept. And so we look into these stories and we say, that is not fair. Why? Because we are looking through this in 2 lenses. Number 1, the sin lens, and number 2, as a human. How many of you are a sinful human? How many of you have realized that if you are in this story, you are one of the people being left off the boat? Okay, so is there an inkling of this is not fair? Now there is a theological concept, and you're all aware of it, and it's uncomfortable. Even the word itself is misunderstood. It is God's wrath. God's wrath. When we hear the word wrath, we immediately think of like revenge or vitriol or hatred, or I'm going to exact justice with violence. But that is not God's wrath. God's wrath is wrapped up in this concept that he gave us free will, and that's a good and beautiful thing. But when we choose sin, his reaction as a just and perfect God is that he has wrath towards sin. Does that make sense? You may recall, the Bible wants to make sure you don't miss this. It says that when Jesus breathed his last, that all of God's wrath was poured out on him. Why? Because this is the idea that this is God's action towards sin. And from our human perspective, it looks very violent, and it looks like the sin, the consequence or the punishment doesn't fit the crime. But God made a good and perfect world where he created us to participate, and he gave us everything we needed. And so God's wrath is an act of, in a strange way for us, it's an act of love. It's a love that says, I made something good and perfect, and I want that to continue. I want to give this humankind, this project that I created to live with me in harmony and beauty, I want to give it a fighting chance. And the way things are going, there is no fighting chance. And so this is the backdrop of the flood. Sorry for all that, but that's an important, I think, concept. I think sometimes we hear these words and we just don't have enough time oftentimes to unpack it. And so I think it's important to unpack some of this. The last thing I want to say before the next discussion question is this, is that Noah does all these things. So God tells him, this is all that's going to happen. This is what you need to do. You need to start collecting some wood, right? You need to start collecting some animals. You need to start storing up a ton of food for yourself and the animals. And what does it say Moses? What does it say Noah did? He did it. We already discussed Noah is the only one living a righteous, just life. What is this situation like? What are you doing today, Noah? Just building a giant boat so large you've never seen anything like it, right? That's dumb. Why are you building a boat? This is a desert, right? Well, God told me to do it. I don't think God told you to build a boat in the desert, especially not a boat that big, right? Why are you storing up all that food? Well, there's, I think, a flood coming. What do you think's going through Noah's mind? Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm wrong. But in the midst of all of it, what does he choose to do? He just decides, I'm just going to walk out what God commanded. I'm just going to do that. I think the takeaway before we go into the discussion is pretty simply this. It's, if you're not sure what to do, how many of you have ever been in a position like work or family, like, I don't know what to do? Try this on for size. Just do what God commands. Well, what does God command? That is why we are here, isn't it? I've been on this rant before. Chester and I go on this rant all the time. If you don't know this, then you don't know God's command. God's command are things like this. If you're like, well, where do I start? I'll give you some that you can write down, but I would encourage you to read the rest. Here are some commands. If you're like, I don't know what to do with my life, I don't know where life is going, here's some. Love your neighbor as yourself. Begin to see other people as made in God's image. Would that be a worthwhile thing to begin? Perfect. What is it? Micah 6:8, right? That you would walk humbly with God, that your act of worship would be that you love justice, that you act kindly, and you walk humbly with God. Are we all capable of saying, you know what? I can take stock of how I'm doing that, I can submit it to God, and I can grow in that. These are things that we begin to do. The Bible says, pray without ceasing. That doesn't mean just walk around with your eyes closed and run into walls while praying. It means submit everything to God, just be in this dialogue with him. That would be a good thing. I think Noah would say you just put your one foot in front of the other, and you just do what God said. If you're not sure what to do, just walk in his commands. Are there going to be times people think that is the stupidest thing they've ever heard? Have you ever heard a story of somebody saying, God told me to do X, Y, and Z, and the story is everyone around me was like, that is not a good idea? Yeah? So here's the next question. Throughout your life, how has peer pressure and conflicting opinions from your peers impacted your obedience to God? So how has pressure from other people impacted how you follow God? So why don't you take 4 or 5 minutes, and then we're going to push on. What's that? Oh, she's already going. Sweet. Rock and roll. I jumped in over here. I was sharing that. Yeah, we're done again, Terry. Come on. I was sharing personally, like, I feel like when I'm new at something, I become like a little insecure about it, and I'm much more susceptible to like other people's opinions, like making me. So my example was, we have 2 kids. We have a 1-month-old and an almost 4-year-old. There are people who will say things about like parenting where I'm like, oh, I better not share what I think, or I better change what I think out loud, because I don't know how this is going to go, right? I remember feeling that way when I first got married. Like, people would come talk to you about marriage or something, and you'd be like, maybe I'm doing it wrong. Like, I don't know. I'm just trying to be me, but maybe I'm doing it wrong. So we talked about age kind of playing into it. How about, not to be like mean or anything, how about some of you old people, you geezers, is that what we call them? Just kidding. Would you say that's true, that as you've gotten older, that's become less of an issue? There's a few of you that I don't consider old at all just answered, so take that as a compliment. I'm glad we're friends. And I should say that you're young in contrast to Noah, because we're going to find out he's multiple hundreds of years old, so maybe that's your encouragement to feel young and rejuvenated tonight. All right, chapter 7. We're going to kind of move a little quickly, because I really want to get to this super weird story at the end. So here's what happens. Raindrops start to fall. I was thinking today, I don't know why I was, I think I've told you this. This is what I do, like 2 hours before this, I feel like I've prayed, I've studied, I've written it all out, and then I just take it, and everybody who works here makes fun of me because I just start pacing. I usually try to find a place that people won't walk in on me because it will look really weird, but I just pace the sanctuary back and forth, and I was thinking, like, is there anything else? And I just started laughing because I thought, I wonder what those first few raindrops felt like to Noah. Were those the best raindrops that ever fell ever? I built this giant boat. I stored up all the food. I got the animals, like, I hope this is the real thing, and the rain starts falling, right? And I feel like not only is it refreshing to Noah, but as the rain like slowly starts to rise a few inches, maybe a few feet, now this thing is slowly getting up off the ground. I also was thinking about all the other people who said things to Noah. I wonder what was going through their mind. It's a very sobering moment. So here's the deal. God tells Noah, here comes the rain, go in the ark. You know the story. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights, 3 times in just this little chunk. Chapter 7, verses 5, 8, and 16, they all say the same thing. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him, over and over and over. And I wanted to jump forward. In verse 18, we don't have time to pause here, but I think it's a good connecting the dots back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. It says in verse 18 that the ark floated on the face of the waters. This is an eerily similar parallel in Hebrew to the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. The idea, I think theologically, is that God is recreating his good and perfect creation in some degree, although there are people on that boat, aren't there? And the Bible's already made it clear that once sin has entered the human heart, it doesn't just come out. So even though God is doing this, God knows full well that there is sin residing in the hearts of even Noah. And we're going to see that in a second. But in the midst of it, it's just a cool parallel that the ark is now floating on the water. And as the waters rise, it returns back to, you remember the Hebrew words tohu, bohu? The chaos and the void. There's nothing. Have you ever, anybody ever been fishing, like deep sea fishing before? You ever, can you remember the first time? I used to go with my dad quite often. Can you remember the first time you were ever on a boat, you drove so far off out at sea, and you turned around and you watched land disappear, and now there's no land? You can't even see land? Does anybody remember that? How vulnerable do you feel in that moment? And then, you're tossing around in the boat, and it's getting turned around, and the captain turns it around. It doesn't take long before you literally, if he was like, here's the keys, and he jumped in and swam away, you'd be like, I have no idea which way to go. And that is the chaos and the void that Noah feels. And so he is floating in the ark. Chapter 8 is the waters are slowly receding. And I love this about chapter 8. Noah is just so smart. He knows those animals. Do you remember the original call to Adam was that he was to know the animals and be in relationship with them? He was to know them so well that he should get to know them and then name them, right? Noah has taken this call seriously enough that he has this cool plan. His plan is, the waters are clearly receding. I wonder if there's dry ground. So what does he do? He sends bird convoys out. I think he starts with a crow, and then he starts using doves, right? And one time they come back with nothing. One time they come back with a fresh twig in its mouth, like somewhere out there, dry ground with something growing on it, right? And then he sends one out again, and it never comes back. Like, Noah knows animals. How many of you would think, that's what I would do? That is not what I would do. I would begin saying to the helpers, like, where are the fattened calves located? So the waters recede. Okay, we're going to continue. So the waters recede. And in the midst of it, I have a feeling that for that amount of time, Noah has a fair bit of time to think. Would you agree? How many of you have ever questioned, I'm not positive this is what God commanded me to do? Anybody ever had that feeling before? I've had that feeling before. I had that feeling 2 times at very pivotal moments in my life, actually. I had a moment I finished college, and in order to pay off a bunch of the loans, I took a job. We talked about this, Matt. I took a job for 2 years. I lived in a special needs community. I was the roommate of a man with Down syndrome that was living as independently as possible. And I remember thinking, I'm just biding my time before I pay off enough student loans, and then I'm going to seminary because that's where God called me. So I waited, and I did everything exactly how I thought God had called me to do it, and I was positive that I wanted to go to this one particular seminary, so I applied to it. I sent all the application, early deadline. I knew people from college who got worse grades than me that got in there, so I'm like, I only need to apply to one of them. And then if you know anything about admissions, I remember checking the mail, and when I opened it up, there it is, but it was the envelope this size. You know what that means? Because if you got accepted, they send you the full packet, because back then you got to start filling out all the paperwork, right? So as soon as I got it, I immediately knew. And it was like just the sinking feeling like, is this what God called me to? I was positive it was. Long story short, I took some wisdom and I applied to a different seminary, and they're like, hey, do you want to come partially, like almost for free? And I'm like, well, that's way better than what I had planned before. I didn't know that was a thing. So it ended up working out, but I remember feeling that like sense of dread and doubt of like, wait a second. This wasn't like God's like whisper in my life. This was like God's shout in my life. I've written it down. I've prayed for it. I feel so confident. And in that moment, it was like, maybe I have it wrong. And I feel like in that moment, Noah, all of the doubts and all of the, do I have it wrong building a giant boat? Do I have it wrong pretending to be like a horticulture biologist collecting animals? Like, is this going to go wrong? Am I going to get attacked by a lion? I don't know. And then in that moment, it's God is good. Being obedient to God is the salvation of Noah. And so chapter 8, verse 20. Then Noah, so he gets off the ark. I want you to notice this. If you haven't been paying attention, pay attention to this. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and he took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. There's a lot going on here, but I want to point out something right now. Noah gets off the ark. What is the first thing Noah does? Burns the birds he just saved. What does he do? He builds an altar and he does a sacrifice, which in Old Testament terminology is what? He worships. Did God command him to worship? The free will creature that God created, Noah, his first response, not because God forced him to or God suggested it strongly, is what? He gets out. Has anybody sacrificed an animal in worship like this yet in Genesis? He gets out and he worships God. That is his heart's response to those days of reflecting on what God had done. Is that cool or what? Not because he's been coerced. This is his free will decision. How many of you would say, hooray, he got it right? Okay. Hooray, he got it right, yeah. Because in just a second we're going to say, no, Noah, you got it wrong. But we're not there yet. This sacrifice, verse 21 says that the Lord smelled it and it was a pleasing aroma. If you've read the Old Testament before, what does pleasing aroma mean? It means like really good. Because God's not just smelling your sacrifice, he is looking at the intention of the heart of the one sacrificing. So not only does Noah choose to worship, God looks in and sees the intent of his heart in this worship is so pure and wonderful. God makes a promise and says, I'll never do it again because of Noah's worship in that moment. Isn't that incredible? And then he says, never going to do this again. While the earth remains, verse 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Okay. Do you remember at the very beginning I told you to put a star or a question mark next to Noah's name? What was Noah's name all about? Rest. Does Noah in some way live up to his name? Think deeply, and don't just think. Think with your eyes on the page. What does God just establish? Seasons and cycles. So what is the agricultural cycle? Is there going to be toil that breaks your back in the hot sun? Yes. Will it be like that always? Not anymore. Now there will be seed time There will be harvest, but there will also be storing. There will be hot weather, and there will be cold weather. So does Noah live up to his name? In some degree, yes. And look at what God says. He says, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. Have they ceased? Did Noah live up to his name? Do we still live in this? Because of who? Noah. Isn't that cool? It's really cool. It doesn't say that God was like, oh, you did so good. Let's go back to Adam and Eve status. You don't have to do anything except name the animals and help me make things flourish and do meaningful work. There's still backbreaking labor. And because of sin, we have still made backbreaking labor a terrible thing that only a certain few bear the brunt of, right? We've done this to creation, but does the core of what God created still exist? There will be a seed time and a harvest. There will be a hot and a cold. Summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. There's a discussion question there, but I want to make sure we have time for the final chunk, because this is about to get a little weird, like very weird. I'd say this might be like the first like truly head-scratching, what on earth is going on in the Bible? You guys ever seen those like books or have somebody who just knows all the weird stuff in the Bible? Do you know the guy who's like, well, you know, in Leviticus 71, you're like, I didn't even know there was 71 chapters. This is crazy. My favorite was I was in high school and I asked somebody, a small group leader, do you know any crazy stories? People are telling me crazy stories. He's like, oh yeah, have you heard the one about the bear who comes out of the woods and eats the kids? And I'm like, that's not in the Bible. It's in the Bible. 2 Kings chapter 5, look it up. Don't mock the prophet. That's the... Yeah. Okay. And God blessed Noah. This is chapter 9, verse 1. And his sons. And he said to them, what does he say? It's the same exact thing he said to Adam. Be fruitful and multiply. That's two things. We talked about it last week. Let's do the second one first. To multiply is procreate and have kids. Right? Populate this place. Right? Raise kids in the ways of God. Teach them to listen to God's command, and they will be reflections of God. They will help the creation flourish and all the things that I commanded you to do. That's the fruitful piece, right? To make what I've created beautiful and good so people see it and think, God is so good. So they get the exact same charter, I would call it, as Adam and Eve. The fear of you and the dread of you shall, we're going to skip over this part. No, we'll just read it all. It's there. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands they are delivered. Scholars just say this is what we learned in Genesis 1 and 2. This is dominion. This is that in the perfect created order, the creatures know that they are not above you, that you rule over them. And we talked about that too. Ruling is not like with an iron fist and I'm the boss. Ruling is I am a representative of God that seeks the best for all things in creation. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply it. So here's the deal. The deal is that violence and murder will absolutely 100% not be tolerated. You ever read Leviticus? Murder will not be tolerated. Murder is the crime that says, I do not recognize God's image in you. You are not worth dignifying with even life. It's a very steep thing. And that is a return back to one of the reasons God flooded the creation to begin with. I would encourage you to look up the lifeblood thing on your own. It's interesting, but we just don't have time. One thing I wanted to point out, I have these moments because I think there's a difference between Bible study and preaching. Would you agree with that? And I think sometimes there's like this preaching element of like, that's just too good of a takeaway to leave out. And I was thinking about Noah, and I was thinking about, because of his faithfulness, we have these seasons of planting and harvesting. And I was thinking, I don't think Noah knew in the moment that what he did would continually be a blessing to us now. That sometimes we don't recognize the perspective or the grandiosity. Is that a word? Is it? Okay, cool. I don't think we maybe recognize that one act of obedience or faithfulness. We often just see our lives in tunnel vision, like us and our family and maybe our community. Like, I'm going to do the right thing because it's important for the people around us. But we don't recognize that these things kind of like, one theologian says, they echo. They echo like eternally. They become a blessing to all people at all times, even if you can't like one for one say that's why, like Noah. But our faithfulness and our obedience echoes. And it becomes like a outward growing, what is it called when you throw a rock in a pond? Ripple. It's a ripple that impacts people 10, 20, 50 degrees separated, and we never even know it. So I think it's important for us to consider that. Okay. Are you ready for the creepy, weird, strange stuff? We got 9 minutes. I think I can do it in 8. Okay. Okay, before we get into it, I need to sip, and then we need to remind ourselves of one thing. Okay, so we have to remember this or we're going to miss it. Because the Bible has been kind of boosting Noah's credibility and stock in the last chapter. Would you agree? He's like willfully, free will worshiping. He sets forth a blessing that all of mankind forever experiences. He's the only guy who survives off the boat. He gets the same thing as Adam, be fruitful and multiply. And we might forget that there's something that Noah carries with him, and it's sin. The Bible was clear that with Adam and Eve, every single descendant would carry the curse of sin and death. Do you remember that? So despite Noah, despite his faithfulness and his obedience, he's carrying with him sin. Has it grown out of him yet? No, we haven't seen that. This is the joys of being over in this building. I was telling Joel, he was like, I hope we're not too loud. I told him, it's kind of like a crying baby in church. It just splits the room in half. Half the people are like, oh gosh, a crying baby in church. And then the other half are like, oh my gosh, it's so sweet to have a crying baby. I'm glad babies are in church. You know? So I don't know where you fall. If you don't like youth group noise, you should sit on this side of the room. So here's the deal. Sin is lurking. And remember, it's not just Noah, it's his family too. And so sin is lurking. And it might be below the surface, and we might not be able to see it just looking in, but God can see it because God knows it's there. And so when we read this story, we have to remember that sin is in Noah. It just hasn't expressed itself in a way that we have read yet. Noah began to be a man of the soil. That's good. And he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Well, that was a 180-degree shift. So what this means is Noah gets off the boat. He worships God. He receives a blessing for all mankind. Then he's like, what should my occupation be? I'm going to be a farmer. He plants a vineyard. These are very intentional steps, by the way. It's not like he stumbled upon like a bar and someone's like, hey, you should try this. And he's like, oh, I'll give it a try. No, he plants the vineyard. He harvests the grapes. He squeezes the juice. He ferments the juice. And then he gets wasted drunk. And we're going to find out he's not just drunk, he's passed out. That's important. We're going to read that in a second. So he becomes passed out drunk and he lay uncovered in his tent. What does that mean? Naked. He's naked. And Ham, by the way, we didn't read all of this. Ham is Noah's youngest son. Ham, the father of Canaan, who is Noah's grandson, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. So underline, saw the nakedness. You probably already know this, but throughout the Old Testament, anything having to do with human excrement and sexuality is almost always innuendo. It almost never says what it means. And Ham, saw the nakedness of his father, and then he went and he told his two brothers outside. Okay, that's interesting. Why did he do that? We're going to get to it. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment. These are the other two sons of Noah. They laid it on both of their shoulders, and they walked backwards, and they covered up the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, so what does that mean? He came to. Maybe he's not even sobered up all the way. He's just like got his eyes open now, right? Now listen, this is interesting. This is part of the innuendo. And I got to tell you, I think about 50% of the innuendo people have their hands around. The other 50% is a total mystery. When he awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him. That's interesting. What did the youngest son do to him? No, the youngest son. Well, is looking at somebody like doing something? So this is part of the innuendo. We'll get there. Cursed be Canaan, my grandson, is what Noah says. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Shem is one of Noah's sons, and he's saying, let his nephew be his servant forever. May God enlarge Japheth, my other son, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and then he died. The end. Abrupt. So what's happening? I don't know about you. These are the things where I just scratch my head. And have you ever just been on like a Bible study rabbit trail where you're like, what is going on? You ever had that happen? And sometimes you figure it out and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so wonderful. And sometimes you're like, I just wasted so much time and Google has no clue what it's talking about. This is where I've landed. This is where I've landed. There is, I would say, the surface level story, and we're going to talk about that, but then there is kind of the macro story, and I want to tell you what that is first. The macro large story is this, that the creation of humankind started with Adam and Eve in a garden. Do you remember this? And what was their end in the garden? They were naked and ashamed, and then God pronounces a curse over them. Do you remember that? God, kind of in an illustrative way, he recreates through the flood story. And how does the story end? It ends in the garden that Noah has planted for himself, and he is now naked and ashamed, pronouncing curses on his own grandchildren. Okay, that is kind of the macro story. They are bookends that these stories end in similar fashions. I think this is what the Bible would say. Do you know why they end in similar fashions? Because when sin enters and begins to rule, guess what sin does? It starts spiraling everything out of control, and where is it pulling it to? What is the gravitational pull? Back to chaos and disorder. That is the big story. Now here is the 50% that I can give you with some certainty. It is pretty much unanimous that saw the nakedness does not mean that you just looked at somebody naked. That is not what that means. There's places in Leviticus, there's a place in Ezekiel where that is not what it means. It means a couple things. It can be sexual violence of some kind. It can just be like husband and wife having intercourse. So it means something, and it has a flexible meaning. The scholars that I've read that I feel like they're onto something would say this, that this whole thing, let me try to connect the dots here. So somehow Ham does something to Noah, and when Noah realizes what has been done to him, he curses Ham's son. There's also something that Ham does to his father. He's the youngest son, and the first thing he does is tells his older brothers. So this is what most scholars would say. They would say, and I think if they're honest, they don't know what he actually did. But what he did do was something that would intentionally humiliate and highlight his father being drunk with the purpose of ascending beyond the youngest son's status. So somehow he gains power over his father by doing something to him and highlighting the fact that he's so drunk he doesn't even know. Some scholars have suggested possibly castration or some type of like cutting scar to make it obvious that like you were there, you were so drunk that you didn't even know. You let yourself get so out of control, now you bear some mark of some kind. And the reason he tells his brothers is more or less that dad's shame is so great that I have now ascended above him. Which would make sense why when Noah says he comes to and he realizes what was done to him, he lashes out, and what does he do? He curses Ham's son. Cursing someone's son in the Old Testament is basically saying, maybe you got the upper hand, but the generations after you will never get those blessings because I'm pronouncing a curse on your family. Does that make sense? Is that a crazy story? And then the story just ends. It just tells you nothing else. It says literally, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Is there nothing notable in the 350 years that we should know about? Get it? Know about? Nothing. And then he died. That's it. That's the end of the story. So ends with naked and ashamed in a garden. I wanted to leave you with one thing. Both these stories in a garden do not end well, do they? We sometimes forget, especially when we read the New Testament, and if you've gone to church for a long time, most sermons are from the Old Testament or the New Testament? Usually the New Testament. How many of you would say that if you just attended church every Sunday for 10 years, how many of you would say you would know significantly more about the majority of the New Testament than you would the Old Testament? Is that true? Okay, we forget that Jesus of Nazareth, the person, knew this story inside and out, upside down and backwards. He knew it in Hebrew. He knew it in Aramaic. He knew what every single rabbi interpreted it to mean. He knew everything about this story. And he knew that at the very beginning, these garden stories do not end well. At the end of his life, when the temptation is going to set in, where does Jesus choose to go to pray? He goes intentionally into a garden. We talked about this in Matthew. He intentionally goes into a garden, and what does he do? He reverses the curse of what had been happening in gardens throughout the Bible. Does he encounter the greatest temptation of them all? Greater than Adam and Eve. Why? Because Adam and Eve are tempted, but they are made in God's image. Jesus encounters the devil in the garden as God. And he reverses the whole course of history by, in a garden, intentionally, on purpose, knowing these two stories. He goes in, his friends abandon him, he is alone, and he succeeds, and he is the victor. Is that a cool connection? Now, I have one more for you. We don't have time, but this is homework if you want it. It's one of the most misunderstood, or I don't even think it's understood. This is like one of the stories that nobody gets. So maybe you could take a stab at it, but I think they're connected. In Mark chapter 14, starting at verse 46, something happens. A man in the garden jumps in, and he gets his clothes ripped off him. Do you remember this? And he runs out naked. And Mark wants you to know that there was a naked guy in the garden, and he was so ashamed, instead of entering the fray, he booked it. Interesting? Do you think there's some connection with nakedness and a garden and shame and all this stuff together? I think there is. I have no idea how to crack that nut, but I think it's there. So if you want a really cool Bible project that might lead you 10 hours to nowhere, that's for you. It's part of the fun. It's part of the fun. Let's pray together. If you would, we'll stack chairs. You can leave the tables as they are. If anyone's willing to, I'd really appreciate just some help kind of expediting stuff to the kitchen. That would be awesome. But let's pray together, and then we'll hang out and dismiss. God, thank you. Thank you that your word is fun. And thank you that when we jump in, we're refreshed, we're challenged, we're encouraged. All of these things come alive in us. And God, I just thank you personally that sometimes there's so much going on in life, but when we really submerge ourselves in your word, it is a relief. It's a respite. It reminds us where our eyes are to be set, and they're to be set on you. And so, God, in the midst of confusion, we ask that you would be gentle and remind us just to step forward and do what you've commanded us to do. If we're not sure what that is, would we surround ourselves with people who know? Would we rise to the challenge of reading your word and knowing it? And so we just give you ourselves. We give you ourselves fully. We ask that you would transform us and change us, and you would do it in a way that we would see it and we would be overjoyed. That you would give us back to ourselves in a way way better than we could have ever imagined. So we love you and we give you this time. Amen. Amen. Now you know a guy.